When I first started this channel, I said to myself that I wasn't going to do anything on leather binding. So this is the one video that I thought I wouldn't make. And the reason for that is that although I had a fairly decent grounding in basic case binding and the type of library and repair work that one often does, I really had only just started doing leather work before I went off far from any other bookbinders, and so really everything I've done with leather has been self-taught, and I've had lots of trials and errors. So yeah, I sort of had lots of imposter syndrome, but at the same time I realized that some of the challenges I've faced are probably the sort of challenges that other people might also face, particularly because I'm in a context where it's not possible to easily get proper bookbinding leather, and so I've had to find ways around that. And so I thought that in this video I will share how I get around the problem of not having proper bookbinding leather and how I prepare veg tanned leather for using in bookbinding. Basically, it can get a bit more complicated than this, but most leather is either veg tanned or chrome tanned. Now, for leather workers, there are all sorts of pros and cons and things. But bookbinding leather is veg tanned, proper bookbinding leather. While it's veg tanned, it also has extra processes. So most veg tanned leather will look, this is natural or veg tanned leather, will look something like this. This is calf skin. Often cowhide is used, but the tanning process, yeah, this is a natural. Whereas chrome tanned leather is often used for upholstery leather, and it's usually much softer. And in some ways, people might initially think, oh well, that's easier, but it's actually not. Certainly not for what we would want. So when I first came back to South Africa and needed to, well, yeah, needed, but most people who want binding done do tend to want leather, and colleagues in Cape Town had said, yeah, use Napa, which was chrome tanned, and that's sort of the route I went, and it was rather a dead end. Well, it might work for some things, but it's not ideal. And it was really only after I sort of switched to veg tanned leather and found a source for that I realized, yeah, that was really a much better option. The two main things being, well, three main things really, is that with veg tanned leather you can dye it yourself. Now, you might not want to, but especially if you're in a context where you don't have great variety, that can be helpful. The second thing is that you can tool it with heated brass tools, whereas chrome tanned leather doesn't take tooling well. And the third thing is that it's much easier to pare, to thin down. And I'm not going to discuss that now, but I will hopefully in the next video. So yeah, so I would strongly advise that. However, most veg tanned leather that you'll get, which will look something like this, although often it might even be thicker than this, is geared more to leather workers who are using it for different things, so it may well be thicker, and it's usually also much harder. So I've, through a process of trial and error, sort of found my own ways of what works in terms of dyeing and softening it, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate in this video. And yeah, then there are also various other techniques you can do with dyeing. I've also done some marbling on leather. Oh, and this is dendritic printing, but I'll maybe do separate videos on that, and also a croquelle technique, which I'll find a photo to show. Now, the leather that you use will largely depend on what's available to you. Obviously, if you are able to get proper bookbinding leather and can afford that, that's different, and this is really for people who can't. What I've got here is just really what I use, and I've used both calf skin and goat skin. this is calf skin. The trouble is I have sometimes managed to get a really nice thin calf skin, but this one is really thicker than I would like to be able to use. So really, yeah, it does depend on what you can get, or if you have access to somebody who can split it for you or thin it further. So most of the time what I'm using now, I'm just saying that's a bit marked, so now let's stay with this one, is goat skin. And this one is actually, yeah, initially I would have said not ideal because it's a sort of glazed goat skin that's sold as a liner. But yeah, with the way I work with it, it actually, you know, turns into something quite nice. So that's really what I do. But the process I'm going to show is something that I've used both for natural calf skin and in fact for cowhide as well. Although that's, yeah, I find it difficult to get a really thin even more difficult to get a really thin cowhide. So at the moment I'm using goat skin, but I do sometimes use calf skin, and yeah, and there are also other options to consider depending where you are. But yeah, you will want something fairly thin. Now this is, I think, just under a millimeter. That's just over a millimeter, and yeah, I've sometimes got it there. But I would say you want something between half a millimeter and a millimeter, ideally. But again, that will depend on where you are and what you can get. Now, what I'm doing here is dyeing this piece of veg tanned goat skin. I'm going to do a brownish color. I use spirit dyes, and the reason for that is that was all I could get locally initially. I think that might have changed, but it works for me. I just do it by hand with a piece of cotton wool. You might find better methods. And I find that the secret, if you do it by hand, in order to not get it splotchy and uneven, is to dilute your dye. So I normally, with each color, and I tend to mix my colors as well, but I will have one bottle that's diluted and then one bottle that's neat. And I always start off with the diluted one. Varies a bit, but I work on a rough average of 1 to 3, and then I'll dilute, so one part neat dye and then one part mets, methylated spirits. I use the clear one. I have sometimes initially used isopropyl alcohol, but really it's not necessary. This works just as well. So what I do then is I'll simply start going over it, and I want to build it up gradually in order to, because you will get streaks initially. This one is actually somewhat darker than I normally have them. And I find with this leather that sometimes you don't know exactly what to expect, because it may have blemishes that aren't initially visible but only come out later. So sometimes you'll need to work around that. But yeah, with this stuff, really you need to find what works for you depending on where you are and what you have available. But I'll usually try and give it a few coats going over it from different directions. Yeah, some colors I find also work easier than others. Browns actually aren't always the easiest. And I do tend to also be a bit, which is one of the reasons why I don't easily offer things to order, is I tend to sort of develop my colors as I go and see how dark they go or mix them a bit, and which is not terribly good if you're trying to offer a specific color. So this one I've just done brown, but then I might go, I think now, I'll come back to brown, but what I quite like to do is do just one brief coat of a diluted red. But yeah, I wouldn't do too much of that, but it's, yeah, brings out the colour nicely. But with all this stuff, you can find your own way, and you may also find that another type of dye works better for you. So it really depends on what you have available. And then I'll go back to the brown, I think. It's coming quite nicely, and I think I'll end off with some neat brown then. Could have also given it some darker brown, but I think we'll stick to this. So the neat brown will darken it, but yeah, if you do that right away at the beginning, it tends to be very streaky. Oh no, that's exactly what you're not supposed to do. Let's see if I can rescue it. I have had that happen 1 or 2 times before. And it's on my new mat. Well, we'll have to see how that goes. Okay, that's what you don't do. But I may or may not edit that out of this video. Suppose it would be good not to. Okay, don't do that. Especially not with neat dye. But anyway, it's actually the leather itself has I think come out okay. So there we have it. One thing with spirit dyes is to close them when you're not using them, because they'll evaporate. So okay, so I will now clean up my mat and see how I can manage that. Now, in order to rehydrate my leather, I'm actually going to give it quite a thorough going over. But if you don't do that, I would suggest that you at least damp it with a cloth. This is specifically for spirit dyes. I can't comment about other types of dyes. But yeah, I'd suggest at least damping it like that and then leaving it a bit before you do anything else with it. But what I'm going to show now is something that I have more or less discovered by accident. I realized that the whole process of waiting and working through it actually does make it a lot softer and easier to use. So I don't always do this, but I quite often do. So what I'll do then is just thoroughly wet it and squeeze it out a bit. This, I don't know if it's true of other dyes, but certainly the spirit dyes do make it more water resistant, which you might want, but there are also things that you won't necessarily want that for. So I will wet it, and I'm using this, I think it's actually meant for baking bread with or something. But yeah, you could use any other sort of flat object. And I basically I usually do it on both sides, and at the back I will do it more vigorously, depending on the leather. And the thing with leather is that it's malleable, so you don't want it to sort of get pushed too out of shape. But I'll come back to that just now. So I normally just do this at a sink on a flat surface. I'm using the back of a tray here, and I don't, I don't know scientifically exactly what I'm doing, but it does seem to make a difference and make it easier to work with. However, it is more work, and it also has a drying process involved. So if you need something quick, then it's not going to be a very suitable thing. When I'm working on this side, I'm careful that I'll go like this and not like that, because if it caught on something, you could damage. But yes, I'll basically do that a couple of times and then bring it out. And then what I do, because if you just hang it up on a line to dry, it won't be flat. I mean, it'll pull in different directions. So I use the same, it's the back of a tray, but you could use a piece of Perspex, or at one point I did it on the side of the fridge. So that I'll then sort of push it out, but I'm getting rid of excess excess water, and then I'll leave it to dry. But I want to make it, we want it to dry flat and fairly even, so make sure it's in the shape you want. And that's about it. What I normally do then is I'll stand it up and leave it to dry. And the time it takes to dry is very dependent on the weather, and also on the thickness of the leather. So for this, which is reasonably thin, if it's sort of dry, warmish weather, it'll usually take a day or so. And it's now the next day, and it stood overnight, and then it was outside today in quite good weather, so it's totally dry now. So I'll just take it off. The next thing I do is also something I discovered by trial and error, but I was quite pleased to then discover in a video from Daz Bookbinding that I think it's called boarding. So apparently it is a thing that people do. As I say, I discovered it on my own, and that is simply to, or at least this is what I do, is to really roll it over itself, however you describe this, to really soften it. And I'll normally do that in different directions. And that's much softer and easier to work with. So yes, that's basically how I do it. I am planning to do future videos on some basic elements of working with leather. As I said, I've hesitated to do that, but I am going to. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. Oh, and I did manage to clean my mat, which I was very relieved at. And this, I was really lucky. It's really only at the edge here, which I won't need anyway, way that you can see what happened. But yes, so anyway, that's that's today's video, and I hope there'll be more. And if you've found it helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you want to support me on Ko-fi, you can. But until next time, many thanks.